7 years of silence, 7 years of buildings and blueprints and pretending she was fine. And then she walked through those palace doors and saw him standing 20 feet away in a black suit, looking like the answer to a question she'd spent 7 years trying to forget she'd ever asked. The room kept moving. The music kept playing. The flowers kept blooming white against marble walls. But Lyra Voss had stopped breathing. Because Damien Vercetti, the most dangerous man in Istanbul, the man she'd destroyed with a single phone call, was looking straight at her. And he didn't look angry. He looked like he'd been waiting. If you want to find out what happens when two people who broke each other finally run out of room to hide, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, tucked inside a cream envelope with gold-pressed lettering that smelled faintly of some expensive perfume Lyra couldn't name. She'd stood in her kitchen in her bare feet, coffee going cold on the counter, and read Celine's handwriting 3 times before the words arranged themselves into something she could actually process. You're my maid of honor. Don't argue. Don't make excuses. I need you there. She hadn't argued. She hadn't made excuses. She'd set the invitation on the counter next to the cold coffee, and for a long moment she'd stared at the Istanbul skyline through her floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline she'd helped build, that she'd given 7 years of her life to, that she sometimes stood in front of at night and felt nothing about at all. And she'd told herself it would be fine. A wedding. She'd been to weddings before. She could survive a weekend. What Celine's invitation had not mentioned, what Celine, her oldest friend, her college roommate, the woman who had held her hair back after the worst night of her life, had deliberately chosen not to mention, was the identity of the groom's best man. Lyra found out 3 days before the wedding from a society column she hadn't meant to read, forwarded to her phone as a news alert because her name appeared in a single sentence near the bottom. Among the notable guests expected to attend the Çelik Moran wedding at Palazzo Azzurra is architect Lyra Voss, whose recent completion of the Meridian Cultural Center has been called the most significant addition to Istanbul's skyline in a decade. She'd almost stopped reading there. Almost. But the 4th paragraph mentioned the groom's family, and the 6th paragraph mentioned the best man, and the name sat there on her screen in plain black text, unremarkable, just 8 letters, and yet it hit her somewhere between the sternum and the stomach the way only 8 specific letters in a specific order had ever managed to do. Damien Vercetti. She'd put the phone face down on her drafting table. She'd gone to the window again. She'd spent the next 20 minutes staring at the water and conducting a very thorough internal argument with herself about whether this changed anything, and she'd arrived at the only conclusion that a woman with her level of discipline and professional reputation could reasonably arrive at. It changed nothing. She was Lyra Voss. She had designed 3 buildings in the last 4 years that had appeared on international architecture shortlists. She had keynoted conferences in Milan and Copenhagen and Seoul. She had stood in front of city councils and hostile review boards and told them why her vision was correct and theirs was not, and she had usually been right. She was not a woman who rearranged her life around a name in a newspaper. She went to the wedding. Why? Palazzo Azzurra had been built in the 19th century by an Ottoman merchant with more wealth than sense and a complete inability to resist excess. Over the decades, it had been a private home, a consulate, a hotel of dubious reputation, and finally a restoration project that had taken 11 years and an amount of money that made serious architects argue about whether the result was triumph or pastiche. Lyra had toured it once, years ago, during the restoration's final phase, and she'd stood in the central hall and looked up at the repaired frescoes and thought, someone loved this place enough to bleed for it. She thought about that now as her car wound up the hill toward the palace gates, because thinking about the frescoes was considerably more comfortable than thinking about anything else. The evening had that particular quality that late spring evenings in Istanbul sometimes achieved, the air warm but not heavy, carrying salt from the Bosphorus and the distant noise of the city below, the sky doing something complicated and orange over the water. In the back of the hired car, wearing a gown the color of deep burgundy that Celine had personally selected and had shipped to her apartment with a note reading, "Don't you dare show up in something gray," Lyra watched the lights on the Asian shore and concentrated on her breathing. In, out, Professional. Fine. The car stopped. A young man in a white jacket opened her door. She stepped out onto the gravel forecourt and smoothed the front of the gown and looked up at the illuminated facade of the palace and decided that whoever had handled the lighting design for the exterior ought to be complimented because they'd understood exactly where to place the shadows to make the building feel eternal rather than merely old. She was still thinking about the lighting when she walked through the main doors and saw him. It was the posture she recognized first. Even across the length of the entrance hall, past the mass of guests in formal clothes, past the white flower arrangements that climbed the walls in cascading columns, past the waiters moving with their trays of champagne, she recognized the way he stood before she recognized anything else. The particular stillness of a man who had learned early that stillness conveyed more authority than movement. The precise angle of his shoulders, the way he occupied space without seeming to reach for it. He was in conversation with two other men, his head angled slightly downward toward the shorter one, and he hadn't seen her yet. He was wearing black. Of course he was wearing black. Damien Verschetti had worn black at every formal event she'd ever attended with him, not because it was expected of men in his position, but because he simply liked it, had told her once that color was a kind of noise, and he didn't see why a person needed to make noise with their clothing when there were better ways to communicate. And his hair was shorter than she remembered, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago. He looked older. He looked exactly the same. Lyra stopped walking. The room didn't stop. The music didn't stop. The 200 guests in their evening clothes didn't stop their conversations or pause their champagne or notice that the world had momentarily tilted on its axis. Everything continued exactly as it had been continuing, indifferent and relentless, and Lyra stood just inside the entrance hall with one hand closing slowly around the small burgundy clutch Celine had also sent, and she performed the most important architectural calculation of her career. Distance, approximately 30 feet. Obstructions, significant. Time available before he turned and saw her, unknown, but finite. Options, leave, stay, pretend, collapse. She was not going to collapse. Lyra. The voice came from her left, not from across the room, and she turned to find Celine cutting through the guests with the focused energy of a woman who had been planning this evening for 8 months and had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Celine Chelik, soon to be Celine Moran, was wearing a rehearsal dinner gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent and had the particular glow of a woman in the final hours before the biggest day of her life, radiant and terrified and absolutely certain, all at once. She grabbed Lyra's arm before Lyra could speak. "Don't," Celine said. "I haven't said anything." "You have that face." "I don't have a face." "You have the face," Celine said, "that you have when you're 3 seconds from saying something devastating and completely polite about how you can't stay." She steered Lyra sideways through a gap between guests, moving them both toward the wall, away from the center of the room, and lowered her voice to the register she reserved for things she genuinely needed Lyra to hear. "I was going to tell you. I want you to know that. I genuinely intended to tell you weeks ago, and then every time I picked up my phone I put it back down because I knew what you'd say, and I couldn't. It's my wedding, Lyra. I couldn't have you not here because of—" "I'm here," Lyra said. Celine blinked. "You're not leaving?" "I'm here. I'm your maid of honor. I'm going to stand where you put me and hold your flowers and smile at everyone and do this correctly." She paused. "But we are going to have a conversation about honesty after the honeymoon." Celine exhaled. The relief was so visible it almost made Lyra feel guilty for the fraction of a second it took to suppress the guilt and return to the much more manageable state of controlled neutrality she'd been working on for the last 3 days. "He doesn't know you're the maid of honor," Celine said. "Kerem didn't tell him." "Why not?" "Because I asked Kerem not to." She hesitated. "I thought it might be better if it was mutual. That's a creative way to describe ambushing two people. I prefer engineered encounter." Lyra looked at her oldest friend, this woman she'd known since they were 19 years old and both too stubborn for their own good, and she almost laughed. Almost. "I need a glass of champagne," she said instead. "There's a waiter." "A full glass." She made it through the cocktail hour by staying in motion, This was a technique she had developed over years of professional events, architecture galas, client dinners, city council presentations, the art of keeping herself moving through a room at a pace that read as purposeful rather than avoidant. She spoke to the people she was supposed to speak to. She admired the table arrangements, which were genuinely remarkable, cascading white ranunculus and something wilder, almost native-looking, that she couldn't immediately identify. She found Celine's mother and said everything correct about the venue and the flowers and Celine's gown. She accepted a second glass of champagne and did not drink it too quickly. What she did not do was look directly toward the left side of the hall, where she had tracked Damien's position in her peripheral vision with the kind of spatial awareness that she usually reserved for understanding how a building's load-bearing structure responded to external stress. He was still in conversation. Different people now. A man she vaguely recognized as a shipping executive. A woman in green who laughed at something Damien said and touched his arm. He moved through the room the way she remembered, not aggressively, but with a kind of gravitational quality, people orienting toward him the way they oriented toward open windows on warm evenings, not quite knowing why. She knew why. She'd spent years knowing why, and then spent 7 more years learning how to forget the answer. The signal came for guests to move to the reception hall, and Lyra let herself be carried by the current of 200 people into a room that was genuinely and undeniably spectacular. The main hall of Palazzo Azzurra had been transformed with the kind of obsessive precision that comes from having both unlimited budget and a clear aesthetic vision, which Lyra recognized as a rare combination. The chandeliers, original, restored, each one a small masterpiece of 19th century glasswork, had been augmented with warm lighting that made the whole room feel like the interior of a jewelry box. Long tables in white and gold, an orchestra in the gallery above, the Bosphorus visible through tall windows, the lights of 2 continents reflected on the water below. Even in the state she was in, Lyra felt the room the way she always felt great spaces. As a physical fact, something that arrived in the chest before it arrived in the mind. She found her place card at the head table and sat down, and it was only then, settling into her chair and reaching for the water glass, that she glanced at the seat arrangement and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has already processed a significant shock and is therefore better equipped for the next one, that the place card immediately to her left read, Damien Versetti. Bullshit. He sat down without looking at her first. That was the part that she would remember later, when she was lying awake in the palace's East Wing guest suite at 2 a.m, going over the evening with the obsessive precision she applied to structural postmortems after complex builds. He sat down without looking at her, poured himself water from the carafe on the table, adjusted the position of his fork, and then turned his head and looked at her as though her presence there was the most expected thing in the world. "Lyra," he said. "Not, I didn't know you'd be here. Not, this is a surprise. Just her name." In that voice, which was lower than she remembered and exactly what she remembered. "Damien," she said. Neither of them moved. Around them the head table was filling, Kerem and Celine sitting down at the center, Celine's sister taking the chair to Kerem's right, other members of the wedding party arranging themselves. And there was noise and movement, and the orchestra beginning something soft in the gallery above. And none of it was remotely adequate as a barrier between Lyra Voss and the man sitting 14 inches to her left. "You look well," he said. "Thank you." "The Meridian Center," he said. "I saw the photographs in Architectural Review, the light study on the east facade." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. He was watching her with that particular expression she'd once spent considerable effort learning to read. Composed, attentive, revealing almost nothing, and yet somehow the almost nothing was itself a kind of information if you knew where to look. There were shadows under his eyes. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was being careful. "You read Architectural Review?" she said. "I have many interests." "That's one of your lines." "I have a few that still work," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that stopped just short of a smile, and Lyra picked up her champagne glass and took a deliberate sip and looked out at the room. Fine. This was fine. She was a professional. She could sit next to this man for 3 hours, eat a meal, watch her best friend get married, and emerge on the other side of the evening intact. She had built a cultural center that had been called a meditation on structural honesty by a man in Copenhagen who didn't use that kind of language lightly. She could manage a dinner. How long have you been back in Istanbul? He asked. 4 years? A pause. Very brief. Almost not a pause at all. I know, he said. She looked at him again. Kerem told you. It wasn't quite a question, the not quite a smile again. Eventually, he said. Dinner was served in courses, which meant the evening was organized into manageable units of time, and Lyra had always been better with structure than with open-endedness. She spoke to Celine's father on her right during the first course. She watched Celine and Kerem at the center of the table, Kerem's hand finding Celine's between bites. The way Celine leaned her shoulder into his without seeming to notice she was doing it, and felt something complicated that was not quite envy and not quite longing and was mostly, she thought, just the recognition of something she understood in theory but had not recently experienced. The second course arrived and she turned back to her left and found that Damien was already looking at her. What? She said. Nothing. You're doing the thing. I don't have a thing. You have a thing, Lyra said, where you watch people when you think they're not looking and collect information you don't acknowledge having. You've done it since I've known you. Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort exactly, but something adjacent to it. Old habits, he said. Some habits are old because they should be. And some habits are old because they work. He turned his attention to the food on his plate, cutting precisely. You spoke at the Copenhagen conference last fall, your argument about urban transparency. The idea that buildings should account for how they're experienced from outside the structure, not just from within. I thought you were right. She set her fork down. How do you know about the Copenhagen conference? He didn't answer immediately. He took a careful bite, and she watched the side of his face, the jaw working, the slight furrow between his brows that she had once spent an embarrassing amount of time finding interesting. Damien, people talk, he said. People who go to architecture conferences talk to people who run criminal syndicates? My world touches more worlds than you might think. That's not an answer. He looked at her again, and this time the composition slipped, just slightly, just enough. No, he said, it's not. The orchestra in the gallery above shifted into something with more movement in it, and at the center of the table, Kerem whispered something to Celine that made her cover her mouth and laugh. And Lyra picked up her fork again and made the deliberate decision not to press the question. Not because she didn't want to know the answer, because she suspected she already did. The toast began after the third course. Kerem's brother spoke first, earnest, slightly too long, exactly what you expected from a younger brother who had been given no restrictions on length. Celine's sister followed with something that made the women at the tables nearest the front cry, and Lyra found herself pressing 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, an old self-management technique, to keep her face appropriately composed rather than revealing the specific frequency at which Celine's sister's description of Celine's goodness and reliability and love resonated with Lyra's own experience of those qualities. Then it was Damien. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked out at the room with the same stillness he carried everywhere, and the room quieted faster than it had for either of the previous speakers. Because 200 people with social intelligence recognized instinctively that this was a different kind of presence. Kerem is my oldest friend, he said. His voice carried without effort. Which means I've watched him make decisions, some good, some catastrophic, for roughly 30 years. I've seen him bet incorrectly. I've seen him trust the wrong people. I've watched him choose the longest possible path to things he could have reached in half the time. He paused. And I've watched him, eventually, learn the difference between stubbornness and patience, between holding on and holding out. He lifted his glass. Celine, he said, looking at her directly now, he has been patient for a long time. I hope you know what that means coming from him. A beat. I hope you both build something worth the wait. The room responded. Glasses rose. Celine was looking at Kerem with an expression that had nothing to do with the 100 people watching her, and Kerem was looking back with the same quality, that particular closed circuit, and Lyra raised her champagne with the rest of the room and did not look to her left. But she felt Damien sit back down, and she felt, with the specific clarity of a woman who had spent 7 years getting very good at not feeling things, that the toast had not been entirely about Kerem and Celine. The dancing began an hour later. By then, the formal structure of the evening had loosened, guests moving between tables and the cleared floor at the center of the hall, the orchestra cycling between the kind of music that invited couples and the kind of music that invited everyone. Lyra had danced with Celine's father, who was 72 and surprisingly light on his feet, and with Karem's younger brother, who had too much energy and no sense of rhythm. And she had stood at the edge of the floor with a glass of wine, watching the room and doing what she always did in large social spaces, reading the architecture of human behavior, how people clustered and dispersed, where the gravity was. The gravity tonight had a fixed point. She kept returning to it in her peripheral vision, no matter how deliberately she oriented herself away. Damien was not dancing. He stood near the far wall with two men she didn't recognize, speaking in the low, unhurried way he had with people who worked for him. And every few minutes his eyes moved across the room in the unconscious sweep of a man who had been professionally alert for long enough that vigilance had become structural rather than intentional. And then his eyes stopped sweeping and landed on her. She was ready for it this time. She met it directly, held it for 3 full seconds, and looked away first. Not because she had to, but because there was a calculation in everything tonight, and she had decided that the calculation favored never letting him think she'd forgotten how to control her own responses. She was working on her second glass of wine when Celine materialized beside her. "How are you doing?" Celine said. Not quite a question. "I'm fine. You look like you're performing fine rather than being fine." "I'm always performing fine. That's what fine is." Celine watched her for a moment. "He asked Karem about you 3 months ago." Lyra looked at her. "What?" "He called Karem. This was before we'd even sent invitations, and asked how you were doing, just like that. How is Lyra? What is she working on?" Karem told him about the Meridian Center. She paused. "Karem didn't tell me Damien had asked until last week, which is a separate conversation I'm having with my husband after the honeymoon." "You have a lot of conversations to have after the honeymoon." "I have a very full agenda, yes." Celine reached out and touched Lyra's arm, brief and direct, the gesture of a woman who knew exactly when to stop being careful. "I'm not pushing anything. I'm not engineering anything. I wanted you to know." She was gone before Lyra could respond, pulled away by a relative's hand on her elbow, swept back into the gravity of her own evening. Lyra stood at the edge of the floor and turned her wine glass slowly in her hands and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. Then she set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the far wall. So, she wasn't sure afterward what she'd intended when she crossed the room. The decision had happened somewhere below the level of deliberate thought, in the part of her that was tired of triangulating around him, tired of the peripheral vision management and the careful angling and the controlled breathing that had been ongoing since the moment she'd walked through the doors. He saw her coming. Of course he saw her coming. He always saw things coming. It was one of the things that had made him extraordinary and dangerous and, in the end, impossible. And by the time she was close enough to speak, the two men he'd been talking to had quietly found somewhere else to be. She stopped 2 feet from him. Up close, in the warm light of the hall, the lines around his eyes were more visible, and there was something in the set of his mouth that was different from the Damien she kept in memory. Something more careful, more considered, as though 7 years had taken something and replaced it with something else that wasn't quite better or worse, but was undeniably different. "You followed my work," she said. "Not, hello. Not, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner." Just the things she'd been circling since the Copenhagen comment, since the architectural review mention, since the particular quality of his pause when she'd told him she'd been back in Istanbul for 4 years. He didn't look away. "Yes," he said, "for 7 years. Yes. Every project. Most of them." A slight hesitation. "All of the significant ones." The music had moved into something slower, and the couples on the floor had drawn together, and the noise of 200 people in a beautiful room celebrating 2 people who loved each other was surrounding them on all sides, and Lyra stood in the middle of it and looked at Damien Versetti and felt the whole careful structure of the evening, the fine, the controlled, the professionally managed, develop a crack along a load-bearing wall. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The stillness again, that specific quality of his attention when something actually mattered to him. "Because it was the only way I had left," he said. "The only way you had left to what?" He didn't answer immediately. Across the room, Kerem was leading Celine in a slow turn on the dance floor, Celine's head against his shoulder, his hand flat on her back in that particular way that meant certainty, the gesture of someone who knows exactly where they are. "To stay near you," Damien said. The crack widened. Lyra breathed in slowly through her nose, the old technique, the structural technique, the one that was supposed to keep things from collapsing under unexpected load. "That's not a reasonable thing to have done," she said. "I know. 7 years of reading about my buildings isn't... That's not a healthy response to a breakup, Damien. I know," he said again. His voice was even, careful, stripped of the particular kind of self-defense she'd have expected from him once. "I know what it is." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because you asked." She stared at him. Around them the room moved and the music swelled and the chandeliers threw warm light across 2 centuries of restored plasterwork. And for a moment she was 29 years old again, standing in a different room, holding a phone, saying the words she'd prepared 3 times before she could say them, listening to the silence on the other end that had lasted longer than silences are supposed to last. "I need some air," she said. She turned and walked toward the doors at the far end of the hall that opened onto the palace's exterior staircase. She did not look back to see if he followed, but she heard the rhythm of his footsteps behind her before she'd made it halfway across the floor. The rooftop terrace of Palazzo Azzurra was accessed through a narrow door at the top of a service staircase that Lyra found by the simple method of trying doors until one opened onto stone steps and a draft of night air. She pushed through and climbed without looking back, and emerged onto a broad terrace that wrapped the upper level of the palace's north wing, open to the sky and to the Bosphorus, which lay below them in the darkness like something alive, the lights of 2 continents arranged along its banks in long broken lines of gold. She walked to the stone balustrade and put both hands on it and breathed. The city was doing what the city did at night, humming with its own particular frequency, the low constant sound of 10 million lives conducting themselves simultaneously, the distant horns and engines and music from somewhere below, the water moving dark between the illuminated shores. She'd stood in versions of this view 100 times in 4 years, had measured the skyline against her memory and her blueprints, had watched her own building take its place among the others. She knew this city better in some ways than she knew herself. She heard the door behind her and didn't turn. Damien's footsteps crossed the terrace and stopped a few feet to her right. He didn't speak immediately. He stood at the balustrade and looked at the water, and for a long time neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality up here, away from the noise of the hall. Not comfortable exactly, but honest, the way silence between 2 people who know each other too well can be honest even when it's not easy. "You shouldn't have come up here," she said finally. "Probably not." "Then why did you?" "Because I've been not following you for 7 years, he said, "and I wanted to try something different." She turned to look at him then. He was facing the water, his forearms on the stone, his jacket open, and he looked older up here in the dark without the flattering light of the hall. Older, and more real, and more tired in a way she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror enough times to know it. "What happened to us," she said, "wasn't simple." "I know. I don't say that to start a fight. I say it because I want to be honest with you, and I want you to be honest with me. And if you're going to stand up here with me on this roof, then I need that to be the condition." He turned his head and looked at her. "All right." She looked back at the water. The lights of a cargo ship moved slowly in the dark, crossing from the European to the Asian shore, indifferent and constant. "You built a future around me," she said. "You planned for a version of my life without asking me what that version looked like. You assumed that I would eventually just fit into the shape you'd made for me." "Yes," he said. "And you understand why that was... I treated you like a fixed variable," he said, "in a plan I hadn't consulted you about." "Yes, I understand." He was quiet for a moment. "I understood it about 2 years after you left. I spent the first 2 years being angry and the next 5 years understanding what I'd actually done." She didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you for absolution," he said. "I'm telling you that I know." Lyra's hands tightened slightly on the stone. There was something she needed to say, something she had prepared and discarded and prepared again in the years since the phone call, something she had never said to anyone, including Celine, And standing here on this roof with the city spread below her and the specific exhaustion of the past 7 years sitting in her chest like sediment, she felt the weight of not saying it become heavier than the weight of saying it. That wasn't the only reason, she said. He went very still. I was terrified, she said. I was terrified of what you were to me. Not of your work, not of your world, even though that was real too. But of... She stopped, started again. I needed you in a way I didn't know how to need anyone. And that scared me more than any assumption you made about my future. She looked at him. So when you gave me a reason to leave, I used it. I told myself it was about autonomy and self-determination and the right to build my own life. And all of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The ship was crossing through the center of the strait now, its lights reflected in the water below. Lara watched it and waited for whatever was coming next. When Damien spoke, his voice had a quality she'd heard only a few times in the years she'd known him. Not the composed, controlled register he used for rooms and negotiations and the general project of being Damien Versetti, but something underneath that, the part of him that existed before the performance. I wish you'd told me that, he said. I know. 7 years ago. I know. She breathed. I couldn't. I didn't have words for it then. I'm not sure I have the right ones now. You just used them. She looked at him again and found him already looking at her, and the full force of being looked at by him, of being actually, specifically, carefully seen, landed in her chest the way it always had, the way she'd spent 7 years building architectural and professional and personal defenses against. And she felt clearly and without the ability to pretend otherwise that the defenses were not holding. Damien, she said. I know, he said. I'm not saying... I know what you're not saying. He straightened from the balustrade. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I want you to know that. I'm not... He paused, and the care in his voice was something she wasn't prepared for, more careful than anger would have been, more careful than the certainty she remembered from before. I don't want to make another assumption about what you want. She almost laughed. It came up from somewhere unexpected, that almost laugh, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the water. That's new, she said. 7 years is a long time to practice. She stood there for another moment, both of them at the balustrade with the city below them and the water moving in the dark and the distant sound of the wedding coming up through the palace walls. Then she said, We should go back inside. Yes, he said. She turned from the balustrade. She didn't take his arm or move toward him, and he didn't reach for her, and they walked back across the terrace to the service door with a foot of Istanbul night between them. But before she pushed through the door, she stopped and turned back and looked at him standing at the threshold, and said, You owe me an explanation, a real one. Not tonight, but soon. He looked at her steadily. Whatever you want to know. Everything, she said. I want to know everything you didn't say. She went through the door. She heard him follow, and as she descended the service stairs back toward the noise and light of the reception hall, back toward Céline and the orchestra and the final hours of the night, she was thinking about what Damien had said on the rooftop, the only way I had left. And she was thinking about what it meant that a man who built empires had spent 7 years reading about her buildings, and she was thinking about the cargo ship crossing the strait, moving from one shore toward the other in the dark. What she was not thinking about was what had happened to her phone in the last hour. What she was not thinking about was the alert she would find waiting for her when she picked it up in the cloakroom at the end of the evening. A message from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words, sent 40 minutes ago. You should ask him about Meridian. The cloakroom was off the main entrance hall, tucked behind a paneled door that a person could only find if they already knew where it was, which Lyra did, because she'd spent the first 40 minutes of the evening learning the building's layout the way she learned every building, not from a map, but by moving through it until the geometry became instinct. She found her phone in the inside pocket of her wrap, which the attendant retrieved with the careful, practiced efficiency of someone well paid to handle the possessions of people who didn't like to be kept waiting. She tipped him without looking up. She was already reading. You should ask him about Meridian. 6 words. Unknown number. Istanbul prefix, but that meant nothing. Half the city ran on prepaid SIMs, and the other half of the city that she dealt with professionally had reasons for maintaining distance between their identities and their communications. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time with the specific quality of attention she brought to structural documents that contained information she didn't yet understand but suspected was load-bearing. The Meridian Cultural Center was her building. It was the project that had defined the last 3 years of her professional life. The project she had won through a competitive tender process against 4 international firms. The project she had fought for in 11 separate city council sessions. The project whose funding structure she had personally reviewed and signed off on in the offices of the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality's Urban Development Division. The project that had been called, by the man in Copenhagen, a meditation on structural honesty. Her building. Her name on the drawings. Her reputation staked on every rivet. She stood in the cloakroom and breathed and thought about what a 6-word anonymous message connecting that building to Damien Vercetti could possibly mean, and arrived at the conclusion that she did not have enough information to process it tonight, and that the appropriate response was to return to the reception, do her job as maid of honor, and deal with this in the morning when she wasn't standing in formal wear in a 19th century palace trying to manage 3 simultaneous emotional emergencies. She put the phone back in her wrap. She went back to the reception. She lasted 45 minutes before she took the phone out again. Got. The rest of the evening had the specific texture of something Lyra would remember in pieces rather than as a continuous whole. Celine's first dance with Kerem, the way the orchestra shifted from formal to celebratory, the cousin who wanted to talk at length about a renovation project he was planning in Ankara, the moment when Celine threw her arms around Lyra's neck near midnight and said, "I love you and I'm sorry, and I love you," into her hair. Through all of it, Lyra was present in the way a building is present. Structurally sound, occupying space, performing its function. But somewhere underneath the performance, a question was running that she couldn't shut off. Ask him about Meridian. She found Damien near the end of the evening, standing by the window that faced the water, alone for once, holding a glass of something darker than champagne. He had loosened his tie. He looked, and she had to admit this, standing 20 feet away watching him watch the Bosphorus, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was deciding whether tonight was the night he could set it down. She crossed the room. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him. "I want to show you something," she said. She held up the phone. He looked at the screen, at the message, and she watched his face with the same attention she'd brought to reading structural documents for the last 15 years, looking not for what was visible, but for what the visible thing was concealing. What she saw was complicated. Not surprise. That was the first thing. His eyes moved across the 6 words, and what happened in his face was not the recalibration of a man encountering unexpected information. It was something more like the settling of a man who has been waiting for something to arrive and feels, when it does, not relief exactly, but the specific exhaustion of being right. "Where did this come from?" he asked. His voice was level, too level. "Unknown number, 40 minutes ago." She watched him. "You don't look surprised." "I'm looking at a message on a phone." "You know what I mean." He handed her back the phone. He looked at the water. The muscle along his jaw moved once, the way it moved when he was making a decision about how much to say and to whom. "Damien, this isn't a conversation for tonight. You just told me on a rooftop that you'd answer anything I wanted to know. I said whatever you want to know. I didn't specify tonight." He turned to look at her, and the composed quality of his expression had tightened into something more deliberate, the face he put on when situations required management. She'd seen that face across boardroom tables in memory and hated it then and hated it now. "This involves other people, other considerations. Tonight is Kerem's wedding." "It's also my building," she said. "I know. The Meridian Center has my name on it." "I know, Lyra." "Then whatever considerations you're managing, tomorrow," he said. Not an offer, not quite an order. The space between those two things that was specifically his. That voice he used when he'd made a final decision, and the only variable left was how the other person was going to respond to it. "Give me until tomorrow morning. I'll tell you everything." She stared at him. He held her gaze steadily, and she could feel the calculation running underneath his stillness. Not malicious, she thought, but the deeply ingrained operational habit of a man who had spent 20 years managing information as a survival skill. "You have a problem," she said. "I have a situation. A situation involving my building." "A situation involving several things," he said, "one of which is your building." Around them, the wedding was winding toward its final hour. Celine was on the dance floor with her mother. Kerem was talking with his father near the bar, and across the space of the hall, over the white flowers and the warm light of the chandeliers, over the heads of 200 people who had come to celebrate something beginning, Lyra stood next to Damien Versetti and felt the ground shift in the way it shifted before something structural gave way. "I'm staying at the Palace tonight," she said, "the East Wing guest suite." "I know," he said. He caught the look on her face and added, without apparent embarrassment, "Kerem mentioned the arrangements." 8 o'clock, she said. "Tomorrow morning, the East Terrace." 8 o'clock, he said. She walked away. She did not look at the Bosphorus on her way out of the hall. She did not stop to say goodnight to anyone except Celine, who was finishing her dance with her mother and who looked at Lyra over her mother's shoulder with an expression of cautious, exhausted hope. Lyra gave her a single nod that was meant to communicate. "I'm fine. I'm intact. This conversation will also happen after the honeymoon. Go enjoy your wedding night." She went upstairs. She changed out of the burgundy gown. She sat on the edge of the bed in the East Wing guest suite with the lights of Istanbul visible through the window and the anonymous message still open on her phone. She did not sleep. The East Terrace was smaller than the rooftop. A second-floor garden, stone-paved, with iron furniture that had been painted and repainted so many times it had lost its original sharpness, and low planters full of something with small white flowers that Lyra couldn't name, but that smelled strongly in the early morning air. She was there before 8. She'd been there since 7:30 with a cup of coffee that she'd gotten from the breakfast service on the East Wing landing, and she'd stood at the terrace railing and watched the city below work its way into the morning the way cities did, incrementally, grudgingly, the night peeling back from the edges first. Damien arrived at 1 minute past 8. He was in dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves already pushed to his elbows, and he was carrying coffee of his own, and he had the look of a man who also had not slept, though on him it arranged itself differently than sleeplessness arranged itself on most people. Not wrecked, but compressed, like something under pressure that was maintaining its form through effort rather than through ease. He pulled out the iron chair across from her and sat down without preamble. "How much do you know about how the Meridian Center was funded?" he said. She looked at him. "I know how it was funded. I reviewed the funding documents myself." "You reviewed the documents the municipality presented for your review," he said. "The documents that were prepared for an architect's sign-off. Those documents were accurate as far as they went." As far as they went. "The municipal funding came from 3 sources," he said. He set his coffee on the table and looked at her directly. The composed quality of last night's management face replaced by something more stripped down, the particular focus of a man getting something said that needs to be said. The Public Cultural Development Fund, the Urban Regeneration Allocation, and a private infrastructure partnership channeled through a development company called Kuzi Yapi. "I know Kuzi Yapi," she said. "They have 3 public-private partnerships in the city. Legitimate firm." "The firm is legitimate," he said. "The money moving through it isn't entirely clean." The silence that followed that sentence had a physical quality. The morning air moved. Somewhere below, a truck was making a delivery, the repetitive percussion of unloading. Lyra set her coffee cup down carefully, the way she set things down when she needed her hands to be still and her face to be neutral. "Define not entirely clean," she said. 15% of the private infrastructure allocation, roughly 4 million euros of the total project fund, was laundered through Kuzi Yapi's clean accounts. He paused. The source was a trafficking operation run by a man named Orhan Shaheen out of the port districts. She breathed. "How do you know this?" It wasn't a question, because I was asked, 18 months ago, to facilitate a transaction through one of my shipping operations, a single pass-through. Orhan Shaheen wanted access to a container route I control in the Marmara. In exchange, he offered information about several competing port operations that would have been commercially valuable to me. His voice was even, measured, the tone of a man giving a prepared account. I declined. "You declined. I don't work with trafficking," he said. That has never been part of my operation. There are lines I don't cross." His jaw tightened slightly. When I declined, Shaheen was not. He made implications about already having connections in several major infrastructure projects. He mentioned Kuze Yapi. He mentioned the Meridian Center by name. The blood was doing something specific in Lyra's ears. A high, thin frequency. She recognized it as the sound her body made when it was processing something she hadn't built adequate structure for. He mentioned my building, she said. He mentioned it as an example of his reach, of how embedded he was in legitimate development channels. His eyes were on hers and not moving. I didn't know how seriously to take it. Shahin makes claims. It's part of how men like him operate. They imply connections they may or may not have, because the implication is its own kind of leverage. He picked up his coffee and set it back down without drinking from it. I had my people look into Kuze Yapi quietly. It took 3 months. What they found confirmed enough of what Shahin had implied to make it credible. And you didn't tell me, Lyra said. I wasn't in contact with you. You could have found a way. You're right, he said. I could have. He didn't add anything to that, didn't offer justification or context, just held the weight of it evenly, and somehow that was worse than if he'd tried to explain. She stood up from the iron chair. She walked to the terrace railing, not because she needed to be at the railing, but because she needed to move, needed to put 2 feet of stone pavement between her body and the table where he was sitting. She gripped the iron rail and looked out at the city. Her city. The city she'd moved to 4 years ago for reasons she'd spent 7 years lying to herself about. The city where her most significant building now apparently had the fingerprints of a trafficking operation on its foundation. How many people know? She said. On my side, 4. My financial director, 2 people in my port operation, and me. He paused. Whoever sent you that message last night is a 5th. Someone from your side, possibly. Or someone from Shahin's side with a different agenda. Or someone from the municipality who knows more than they're supposed to. He came to stand at the railing beside her. Not close, not reaching for anything, just bringing himself into the same plane as the conversation rather than sitting at the table like a deposition. I've been working on a way to remove the dirty money cleanly. A retroactive restructuring of the Kuze Yapi allocation that replaces the compromised funds with a legitimate source without triggering a formal investigation that would what? She said, turning to him. Would expose the building? Or would expose you? He held her gaze. Both, he said. She laughed. It came out harder than she'd intended, a short, flat sound with no warmth in it. Both, she said. Great. Wonderful. Lyra, my building, she said, and her voice was doing something she didn't entirely like, losing the neutrality she'd maintained for the last 14 hours with considerable effort, is the most significant project of my career. I have staked my professional. I have given 3 years of my life to that building. I have defended it in front of city officials and international review bodies and critics who said I was overreaching. And the entire time, you knew that it was... I knew for 4 months, he said. Not 3 years. 4 months. And in 4 months you couldn't... I was fixing it, he said. His voice came up slightly, the first break in the composed surface, and the break revealed something underneath that was not calm. I was working on a solution that protected you in the building and didn't drag a trafficking investigation through the middle of your career. That takes time, and it takes work that cannot be rushed without breaking things that can't be put back together. You were protecting me, she said. Yes, from something you knew about and didn't tell me. Yes. She turned fully to face him. He was looking at her with an expression that she recognized now with the specific chill of recognition, because she had seen it before, in a different version, in a different city, 7 years ago. The expression of a man managing a situation that included her without consulting her about whether she wanted to be managed. You did it again, she said. Her voice was quiet. Quieter than anger usually sounded, quieter than she'd expected it to be when it finally arrived. You made yourself the architect of my situation and handed me the result. It's not the same. It's exactly the same. It's not, he said. 7 years ago, I assumed things about your future because I was arrogant and selfish and didn't ask what you wanted. I was trying to protect your work, your name, not to control your life. The effect is the same. The intention is not. Damien, She said his name the way she said the names of calculations that weren't closing, the way she said the names of load-bearing elements that were underperforming. Final, clear. The intention doesn't determine the impact. You should know that by now. He was silent. Below them, the city had fully committed to mourning. Traffic sounds, distant voices, the particular urban chorus of 10 million people conducting their uncoordinated lives. The sun was full over the Asian shore, laying gold across the water, and it would have been beautiful if Lyra had been in any condition to feel beauty, which she was not. I need to know everything, she said, not the version you've managed, not the version where you've already decided what I need to know to feel appropriately informed. Everything. Shaheen, the money, Kuze Yapi, your solution, all of it. And I need you to accept that this is my building and my career, and whatever happens next, I'm the one who decides what to do with that information, not you. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the water for a moment in the way he'd looked at it last night. Not for comfort, she thought, but for the quality of distance it provided, the way some people used physical space to slow their thinking down enough to be accurate. All right, he said. All right isn't enough. What do you need? I need to hear you say that you understand, she said, that this time I'm the one who decides what happens. He turned from the water and looked at her. The morning light was hitting him directly, and it stripped away whatever softness the chandelier light of last night had added and left him simply himself, older, tired, carrying the specific weight of a man who had built something powerful and was beginning to understand the cost of the foundation. You decide, he said. Whatever you need to know, whatever you decide to do with it, that's yours. She studied him. The habit of distrust and the habit of knowing him were running simultaneously in the same channel, and they were not resolving cleanly. Start from the beginning, she said. Orhan Shahin, who is he and what exactly did he offer you? He started talking. She listened. And 40 minutes later, when he had finished and the coffee had gone cold and the morning was fully established around them, she sat with the information the way she sat with a structural problem, turning it over, finding the load points, tracing the consequences from origin to surface. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was different from last night's. Not unknown this time, but a name she recognized. Seren Polat, the junior associate at her firm who managed administrative communications and who would not be calling at 8:47 on a Sunday morning unless something was wrong. She answered. Seren, Lyra Hanım. Seren's voice had the particular texture of someone trying to sound professional while not being professional, the thin coating over something more alarmed underneath. I'm so sorry to call. I know you said not to. What happened? There's a journalist. From Shahir Haber. He called the office line last night, left a message, and then this morning he called my personal number. He's asking a breath. He's asking about the funding structure of the Meridian Center, about Kuze Yapi specifically. He says he has documents. The iron railing was cold under her hand. He's running a story? He says he's running it Tuesday. He's giving us until Sunday evening for a comment. Lyra looked at Damien. He had gone still in the particular way he went still when he'd registered a threat and was processing it. Not frozen, but concentrated. All of his attention gathered into a single point. His name? She said into the phone. Tarek Demir. Seren paused. Lyra Hanım? Do you know what he's asking about? She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then opened them and looked at the city below. At the skyline. At the space where her building stood among the others. At the Meridian Center's distinctive silhouette visible from this angle above the lower rooflines of Besiktas. Yes, she said. I know exactly what he's asking about. She hung up and looked at Damien, and what she felt in that moment was not fear and not anger, but something beneath both of those, something more foundational. The particular vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the ground they were standing on was never quite what they thought it was. 4 months, she said. Yes. And you were going to fix it before anyone found out? Yes. How's that working? He said nothing. There was nothing to say. She picked up her cold coffee and drank the last inch of it and set the cup down on the iron table and looked at her building against the Istanbul morning sky. I need to make some calls, she said. Lyra, I need to make some calls, she said again. And then I need you to introduce me to whoever you've been using to restructure the Kuzi Yapi allocation. Because if a journalist has documents and a Tuesday deadline, your 4 months of careful management just became 48 hours. He was already reaching for his phone. And Damien, she said. He looked up. When this is over, when we've dealt with this, we're going to have a very long conversation about the difference between protection and control. And you're going to listen to the whole thing without managing it. I know, he said. I need more than I know. I'll listen, he said, to every word, whatever you need. She nodded once, brief, the nod she gave when she'd received information and was moving forward. Then she dialed, and somewhere below them, across the water, on the Asian shore, in an office she'd never visited, a story with her building's name on it was 47 hours from going to print. The first call she made was to her lawyer. Amir Kaya had been her legal counsel for 3 years, a compact, unhurried man in his late 50s who had navigated her through 2 contract disputes and 1 attempted intellectual property claim by a developer who had looked at her Meridian Center designs and decided that inspiration was the same thing as theft. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was already awake and already working, which was the thing she paid him for. I need to talk to you today, she said. Not tomorrow. Today. A pause. How serious? Serious enough that I'm calling you on a Sunday at 9 in the morning from a wedding I haven't left yet. My office at noon, he said. I'll be there. She hung up and looked at Damien, who had made his own call in the 60 seconds she'd been on hers, and was now standing with his phone held loosely at his side and the expression of a man recalculating distances. My financial director is available this afternoon, he said. Bora. He built the restructuring proposal. He knows every number. I want to see the original documents, she said. Not summaries, the actual transaction records from Kuzi Yapi. Bora has them. I want copies. You'll have them. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had spent the last 40 minutes dismantling the version of the Meridian Center she thought she'd built, replacing it piece by piece with something that had the same shape but different bones. And she made the decision that she would process what she felt about that later, in private, when she was not standing on a morning terrace with a 47-hour deadline and a journalist with documents. My lawyer. Noon, she said. Your financial director. When? I can have Bora at your office by 3. Not my office. Somewhere neutral. She thought for a moment. The Karakuri building. 4th floor conference room. I still have key access from the Merrick Project Consultancy. 3 o'clock, he said. And Damien. She picked up her wrap from the back of the iron chair. Find out who sent that message last night. Not because I need you to handle it. Because I need to know whether whoever sent it is trying to help me or whether they're the same person who gave Tariq Demir his documents. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had already been thinking exactly that. I'll know by noon. She left the terrace without looking back at the skyline. Celine was at breakfast in the main dining room, still in her wedding night robe, her hair loose, looking like a woman in the specific peaceful aftermath of something she'd been anticipating for 8 months. Karem was beside her with coffee and the relaxed posture of a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been trying to get to for a long time. Lyra sat down across from them and ate a piece of bread and drank hot water with lemon and told Celine in the careful language of a woman managing multiple simultaneous emergencies that something had come up with the Meridian project and she needed to leave by 10. Celine looked at her with the particular attention of a woman who had known her for 16 years and said, Is it Damien or is it the building? Both, Lyra said. Celine was quiet for a moment. Do you need anything from me? Not right now. Later? Probably. Celine reached across the table and put her hand over Lyra's for 3 seconds, then took it back. Whatever you need, she said. Whatever it turns out to be. Karem, who had the social intelligence to understand when a conversation was not for him, refilled his coffee and looked at the garden through the window. Lyra finished her bread and left by 10. What? Amir's office occupied the top floor of a building in Nishantashu that had been built in the 1930s and never substantially modernized, which was either a preservation achievement or a renovation failure depending on your perspective. Lyra had always considered it the former. The rooms had the particular weight of spaces that had been used for serious things over a long time, and there was something in that weight that she found steadying. She laid out everything she knew in the order she knew it. Amir listened without interrupting, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, his hands flat on the desk, the way he sat when he was storing information rather than reacting to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The journalist documents," he said. "Do you know their nature? Internal communications, transaction records, something else?" "I don't know yet." "That's the most important variable." He pulled his glasses down. "If he has transaction records showing the Kuze-Yapi pass-through, the story is about the funding source. If he has communications, emails, messages between municipal officials and Kuze-Yapi representatives, the story is about institutional knowledge, about who knew what and when. And if it's the second one," he looked at her over his glasses with the expression he used when he needed her to follow an implication he didn't want to state directly. "If officials in the municipality knew the money was dirty and approved the Meridian tender anyway, the story isn't about Kuze-Yapi. The story is about you." She let that sit. "I didn't know." "I believe you. That's relevant to criminal liability and not particularly relevant to public narrative." He leaned back slightly. "A journalist running a Tuesday piece in Shahir Haber is either pursuing the institutional corruption angle, municipality officials, Kuze-Yapi, Shahin, or he's pursuing the architect angle, the person whose name is on the building." He paused. "Those are two different stories with two different targets." "He called my associate's personal number," Lyra said. Amir was quiet. "He went to the trouble of finding her personal number on a Sunday morning to request a comment from me specifically," she said. "Not from the municipality, not from Kuze-Yapi." "Yes," Amir said. "I see." The weight of the room was very present. Lyra looked at the window, at the Nishantasha street below, at the Sunday morning foot traffic, ordinary and unremarkable, and she thought about the Meridian Center, its east facade in morning light, the way the limestone caught the angle of the sun, the interior atrium where the acoustics did something extraordinary with ambient sound that she had spent 6 months calculating and had never once felt entirely was her own achievement rather than a gift from the geometry, her building, her name. "I need to talk to Tariq Demir before he runs the story," she said. "That's a risk. Everything is a risk, but I want to hear directly what he has, and I want him to hear directly from me that I had no knowledge of the funding irregularity." She looked at Amir. "Can you reach him?" "I can try." He made a note. "I'd want to be present." "Of course. And Lyra." He set down his pen. "The man you mentioned, Versetti, his involvement in this, even as someone who declined Shahin's offer, even as someone who discovered the funding issue independently, if his name becomes attached to this story, the story changes shape entirely." He said it without judgment, just the flat professional assessment of a man who mapped terrain for a living. "His presence in this is a complication I want you to be clear-eyed about." She was clear-eyed about it. She had been clear-eyed about it since 8 o'clock on the East Terrace, and the clarity was one of the least comfortable things she'd carried into this Sunday. "I understand," she said. "Do you trust him?" She was quiet for a moment. "I trust that he's not trying to hurt me," she said. Whether that's the same as trust, I'm not sure. Amir looked at her for a moment, then nodded, the nod of a man who considered that a precise and sufficient answer. The Karakuri conference room was on the 4th floor of a mixed-use building that still carried scaffolding on its north face from a retrofit project that had been paused 6 months ago pending a permit dispute. Lyra knew the building the way she knew most buildings in this part of the city, professionally, structurally, without sentiment. She arrived at 2:40 and stood at the window looking at the Golden Horn while she waited. Damien arrived at 2:55 with a man she hadn't met before. Bora Tekin, who was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the compact, watchful energy of someone who had spent years working in environments where imprecision had consequences. He set a hard case on the conference table and opened it to reveal a tablet and a series of printed documents in labeled folders. "Everything you asked for," Damien said. She sat down. Bora sat across from her. Damien took the chair at the end of the table and was quiet in the way he was quiet when he'd decided that a situation called for him to be present, but not central. which was a quality she'd once found extraordinary in a man with his level of institutional authority and had not stopped finding extraordinary. Bora walked her through it with the efficient precision of someone who had rehearsed this for exactly this audience. The Kuzi-Yapi allocation structure. The specific account through which Shahin's money had entered, the percentage, the dates, the two municipal officials whose signatures appeared on the approval documents. Bora laid their names on the table like cards and let her read them without commentary. She read them twice. Then she looked up. Yilmaz, she said. Recep Yilmaz was the lead reviewer on the Meridian tender. Yes, Bora said. Recep Yilmaz had been in the room for 4 of her 11 city council presentations. He had asked technical questions that suggested genuine understanding of structural engineering principles. He had shaken her hand after the final approval session and said, "This city needs buildings built by people who actually love it." She had believed him. She had thought he was one of the people doing the work correctly. He knew, she said. Both signatures were obtained after the Kuzi-Yapi allocation was internally flagged by a junior municipal accountant, Bora said. The flag was overridden. The accountant transferred to a different division 2 weeks later. The room was very quiet. "What happened to the accountant?" she asked. Bora glanced at Damien. Damien looked at her. "She left municipal employment 6 months after the transfer," he said. "She's in the private sector now. We haven't contacted her." Lyra sat with that. The document in front of her had Yilmaz's signature in blue ink, the particular deliberate signature of a man who had been signing documents with authority for long enough that the signature had lost its self-consciousness and become automatic. She thought about the handshake, the things he'd said about love. Then her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. The number was Seren's again, but the message below the name preview was visible. He moved the deadline. "Story runs tomorrow." He says he has new documents. She looked at the screen for 3 full seconds. Tomorrow, not 47 hours. Not a Sunday evening for comment. Tomorrow, which meant the piece was already written, which meant Tariq Demir had not been offering her an opportunity to respond. He'd been performing the procedural requirement of having offered her an opportunity to respond, which was a different thing entirely. "He moved it," she said. Damien was already looking at her. "When?" "Tomorrow." She set the phone face down on the table. "And he has new documents." The specific quality of Damien's stillness shifted, the way a building's silence shifts when something changes in the structural load. He looked at Bora. Something passed between them, quick, wordless, the communication of men who had worked together in high-stakes conditions long enough to conduct full conversations in the space of a glance. "The source who sent you the message last night," Damien said. "I found them." She waited. It was Bora's assistant, a woman named Fegan who has been with my operation for 3 years. He paused. "She was also, we discovered this morning, passing information to a second party." "To Tariq Demir," Lyra said. "We believe so. The new documents he claims to have, they most likely came from materials she accessed in the last 72 hours. Documents related to our restructuring proposal." His voice was level, controlled. But underneath the control, she could hear something that in anyone else she would have called barely managed fury. "The restructuring documents contain my name." The room rearranged itself, not metaphorically. The physical space of the conference room seemed to contract and then expand, the way rooms did when the information in them exceeded what they'd been designed for. "Your name is on the restructuring documents," she said, "as the party funding the replacement allocation. The clean money I was moving in to replace Shahin's percentage." He met her eyes without flinching. "On paper, without context, it reads as evidence that I was involved in the original transaction, not fixing it, responsible for it." She stood up. She walked to the window. Below, the Golden Horn was doing what it always did, indifferent, moving, catching the afternoon light in long silver ribbons. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stared at the water and felt, for the first time since she'd walked into the wedding hall the previous night, the specific sensation of the ground giving way beneath load it was never designed to carry. The story that would run tomorrow was not the story she'd thought it was. It wasn't a story about municipal corruption. It wasn't a story about Orhan Shahin and Kuzi-Yapi and dirty money moving through clean infrastructure accounts. Those elements were in it, certainly, but the frame had changed, and the frame was everything. The frame was the difference between a building that stood and a building that fell. The story tomorrow was about Lyra Voss, the architect who built Istanbul's landmark cultural center with money from one of the city's most powerful criminal organizations. And the man whose name appeared in the documents connected to that building was Damien Vercetti, whose name to anyone who had ever picked up a newspaper or sat through a city council session meant exactly one thing. She turned from the window. Serensetti has new documents, she said. Her voice was doing the thing she didn't like, the careful, over-controlled flatness that appeared when she was managing something too large for her normal register. New, as of this morning. Figen sent the last package at 6 a.m., Bora said. What was in it? Bora opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at Damien. Damien looked at Lyra with the expression she'd been reading since last night, the composed surface over something more honest underneath. And this time the honest thing was not tiredness, and it was not carefully managed feeling. It was something she recognized from 7 years ago, from the last time a conversation between them had arrived at a place from which there was no managed exit. There was an email, he said, from me to Bora, 14 months ago. What did it say? It referenced the Meridian Center, by name. He paused. The context was the Shahin meeting. I was documenting what Shahin had told me so Bora could begin the investigation, but out of context. Out of context, she said. Out of context, it reads as awareness of the funding source. Your awareness, yes? Before the building opened? Yes. She looked at him, at this man she had loved and left and spent 7 years not forgetting, who had spent those same 7 years following her work from a careful distance, who had last night stood on a rooftop and said the most honest things she'd heard said in recent memory, who had this morning sat on a terrace and given her information at a cost she could see in the set of his jaw, and who had known 14 months ago that the building she was finishing, the building she was defending in its final review sessions, the building she was writing the completion report for, the building she was privately calling the best work of her life, had been partially funded by a trafficking operation. 14 months. Not 4. You said 4 months, she said. I discovered the full extent 4 months ago, he said. 14 months ago I had a partial picture. Shahin's implication, not confirmation. But you knew enough to document it. Silence. Damien. Her voice was very quiet now. The quietest it had been. You knew enough to send an email to your financial director saying my building's name in connection with Shahin's operation 14 months ago, and you still didn't. I didn't know what I had yet. You were documenting, she said. You were being careful. You were managing the information while I finished the building and opened it and stood in the atrium and gave interviews about structural honesty. She stopped. The word landed between them with the specific weight of something that had been present in the room the entire time, waiting for someone to pick it up. Structural honesty. That's what they called it. That's what I called it. That's what I believed it was. He said nothing. How long, she said, would you have kept fixing it quietly before you told me? Until it was fixed. And if it couldn't be fixed? He didn't answer. If Figen hadn't sent those documents, she said, if Tarek Demir wasn't running a story tomorrow, if none of this had broken into the open, would you ever have told me? The silence lasted long enough to be an answer. She picked up her phone from the table. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked at Bora, who was studying the documents in front of him with the focused non-presence of a man who understood that his job right now was to not exist. I'm going to call Tarek Demir, she said, tonight, before his deadline. And I'm going to tell him everything I know. She looked at Damien. Not the managed version, not the version where your name is protected or my reputation is managed, or the story arrives at a convenient conclusion. Everything. Yilmaz, Shahin, Kuzeyapi, the restructuring, everything. If you do that, Damien said, my name is in the story. Your name is already in the story. Lyra, my name is already in the story, she said, and my building is already in the story. The question is whether it's told by a journalist working from stolen documents and incomplete context, or whether it's told by me. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she felt and had been carefully not fully feeling since the previous night, the whole accumulated structure of it, and she let him see it. All of it. I choose me. She walked to the door. Lyra. His voice stopped her, but she didn't turn. I'm sorry. Not a managed apology. Not an explanation. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I should have told you the moment I knew enough to send that email. She stood with her hand on the doorframe. I know you are, she said. I'll believe it when I see what you do next. She walked out. The elevator was slow. She stood in it and watched the floor numbers descend and pressed her palm flat against the cool metal wall and breathed through the specific pressure in her chest that was not grief and not anger, but the compound product of both, and something older underneath them. The feeling of having trusted the shape of something and discovering the shape was not the thing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. The same unknown number as last night. The message was 4 words this time. Yilmaz is running too. She stared at it. The elevator doors opened onto the Karakuri lobby. Running. Not Yilmaz is involved or Yilmaz knew, both of which she already had from Bora's documents. Running. Present tense. Active. Recep Yilmaz, whose signature was on the Meridian approval documents, whose handshake she remembered with the specific physical memory of significant moments, was not sitting in his municipal office waiting for a journalist's story to break. He was already moving, which meant he knew the story was coming, which meant he had a source inside Shahir Haber or inside Tarek Demir's operation, which meant that when that story ran tomorrow, whether it ran the managed version or Lyra's version or any version, Recep Yilmaz was going to be somewhere else entirely, and the weight of what remained would distribute itself across whatever surface was still standing. Her phone rang. This time it was a number she knew, Tarek Demir. He wasn't waiting for her to call him. He was calling her. She stood in the lobby of the Karakuri building with the street door in front of her and the elevator behind her and Tarek Demir's name on her screen, and she understood with total clarity that the next 30 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that followed. She answered. Mr. Demir, she said. Ms. Voss. His voice was professional, alert, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call. I'm glad you reached out. I have some questions I'd like. I know what you have, she said, and I know what you don't have. I'd like to meet tonight. A pause. Short, but real. Tonight. Tonight, before your deadline. In person. She pushed through the street door into the Karakuri afternoon. Because what you're about to run isn't the full story, Mr. Demir. And I think you're a journalist who wants the full story. Another pause, longer this time. Where? He said. She gave him an address. She hung up. She stood on the pavement with the Golden Horn 2 streets away and the city moving around her. And she did something she had not done since she was 29 years old and making a phone call she'd prepared 3 times. She did not calculate the outcome. She did not model the load distribution or assess the structural risk or prepare 3 versions of what to say, depending on how the other person responded. She just started walking. The address she'd given Tarek Demir was a cafe in Cihangir that she'd used for difficult meetings before. Not because it was private, but because it was public enough that no one could do anything irreversible. 3 floors up in a narrow building on a stepped street, corner table visible from the door, 2 exits. She'd learned to think about exits in the years she'd spent working in a city where the people who commissioned buildings sometimes had complicated relationships with the law. She got there 40 minutes early. She ordered tea she didn't drink. She sat with her back to the wall and her phone on the table, and she went through the Bora documents again on her screen. The transaction records, the approval signatures, the dates, until she knew them the way she knew structural drawings, not by reading, but by having internalized the load paths so thoroughly that she could reconstruct them from memory under pressure. Tarek Demir arrived 7 minutes late, which she read as deliberate, the journalist's version of arriving on his own terms. He was younger than his byline suggested, maybe 32, with the particular lean alertness of someone who had been running on adrenaline and insufficient sleep for several days and had learned to treat that state as normal. He wore a jacket over a shirt that had been ironed this morning and had not survived the day intact. He carried a leather satchel that he set on the chair beside him rather than on the table, which told her he wasn't planning to open it immediately. He sat down, looked at her directly, and said, "You said I don't have the full story." "You don't," she said. "Tell me what I'm missing." She told him. Not everything. Not Damien's name, not the restructuring documents, not the specific operational details that belong to Damien's world, and that she had no authorization to hand to a journalist regardless of how justified it might feel in this moment. But everything that was hers, the funding structure as she understood it, the Kuzi-Yapi allocation, Yilmaz's signature, the municipal accountant who had flagged the irregularity and been transferred, and the central fact that she, Lyra Voss, had reviewed the documents presented to her and had found them clean because the documents presented to her had been designed to be found clean. Demir listened without writing anything down. His eyes moved between her face and some middle distance while she talked, the specific attention of a person processing information against a framework they already have, checking for alignment and contradiction simultaneously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The accountant," he said. "Do you have her name?" "I don't." "Yilmaz's second signature, the override document." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you have a copy?" "My lawyer has copies of the relevant documents." She held his gaze. "Which he obtained through legitimate channels and which will be available to support any story that accurately represents my position in this." He studied her. "You came to me to shape the story." "I came to you to give you accurate information," she said. "What you do with it is your decision. The difference being that a story about institutional corruption in municipal development funding is true, is significant, and is in the public interest." She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. "A story about an architect who knowingly built with dirty money is also true as a headline and almost entirely false as a description of what actually happened. I'd like you to know the difference before you choose your frame." He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached into the leather satchel and pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table. "Tell me about Damien Verschetti," he said. The sound of the cafe continued around them. Milk steamer, low music, two women at the next table discussing something about a shared apartment. Lyra looked at the folder on the table and then at Demir and kept her face where it needed to be. "What about him?" she said. "His name appears in documents I have, in connection with the Meridian Center funding." He opened the folder and turned it toward her. She looked at the email. 14 months ago, Damien Tabora, her building's name in the third line. "He's a known organized crime figure. His name in any document connected to your building is..." "It's the story, Ms. Voss. You understand that. The context of that document. I know what context means to the person providing it," he said. Not unkindly, just flat. The flatness of a man who had been given context before and learned to look at what context was covering. The document exists, his name exists, the connection exists. The connection is that he discovered the funding irregularity and was working to correct it, she said. Without that document existing at all, Shahin's money stays in the foundation of that building permanently, and no one ever knows. Or, Demir said, his name in that document indicates involvement at a level beyond what you're telling me. She looked at him, at the folder, at the email that Fegan had photographed or copied or forwarded from somewhere inside Damien's operation, the email that Bora had written in the unguarded language of internal communication, the email that had no context tag, no explanatory header, just Damien's name and her building's name and a date 14 months ago. Her phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the screen. Damien. She turned the phone over. "Mr. Demir," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "I can try." "Is Recep Yilmaz a source for this story?" The quality of his stillness changed, just slightly, just enough. "I don't discuss sources." "That's not a no." "It's not a yes either." "Yilmaz is running," she said. "I have information suggesting he knew your story was coming, and he's already in motion. If he's a source, he's using your story as a diversion, feeding you information about Kuzi-Yapi to control what gets published and when, so that his own name appears in a context he can manage while he puts distance between himself and whatever comes next." Demir's jaw tightened, briefly, almost invisibly, but she'd been reading faces across tables for 15 years and she caught it. "The document trail I have," she said, "includes Yilmaz's approval signature on the override that buried the accountant's flag. That signature is not in the documents you have. I know this because the documents you have came from a source inside a private operation that would not have had access to the municipal override file." She watched him. If your story runs without that document, Yilmaz walks away clean. The story becomes about Kuzeyapi and Shaheen and a criminal's name in an architect's funding file. Yilmaz becomes a peripheral figure, maybe a victim of an irregular process, maybe someone who didn't look closely enough. She paused. Is that the story you want to run? The cafe steamer went again. The women at the next table laughed. Demir picked up the folder and closed it. He set it back in his satchel. He looked at her with the expression of a man revising something, the specific internal quality of recalculation. The override document, he said. Can your lawyer have it to me by 9 tonight? Yes, she said, and you'll provide a formal statement. On record, not a background comment. On record, she said. He stood up. He picked up his satchel. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't admiration exactly, but was adjacent. The look of a man who had expected a defensive interview and had gotten something else. Ms. Voss, the Versetti angle is still in the story. I can give it context. I can make it about the discovery and the correction rather than the origin. But I can't remove a name that's in documents I already have. I know, she said. You're all right with that. I'm not all right with any of it, she said. But I understand the difference between what I control and what I don't. He nodded once, turned, and walked down the stairs. She sat at the corner table for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Amir and told him to have the override document to Tariq Demir's personal email by 9. And then she called Seren and told her to prepare a statement for publication and to copy nothing to the firm's shared drive until further notice. And then she sat there with the phone in her hand and the cold tea in front of her, and the city doing what it always did outside the window. Then she turned the phone over and looked at the missed call from Damien. She called him back. He answered before the first ring finished. Where are you? Tihangir. I just met with Demir. A pause. And? He has the email. He's running your name. She kept her voice even, factual, the voice she used for structural assessments. I gave him context. He'll frame it as discovery and correction, but your name is in the story. The silence on his end had a specific quality. She'd known this man long enough to know the difference between his silences, and this one was not surprise and not anger. It was the silence of someone absorbing a consequence they'd understood was coming. All right, he said. That's all you have. What do you want me to say? I don't know, she said. Something human would be acceptable. Another pause. I knew it was possible, he said. When Bora told me about Figan this morning, I knew the email existed, and I knew what it looked like without context, and I knew... He stopped. I chose not to tell you this morning because I was still calculating whether there was a way to manage it. Yes, Damien. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. I understand why you do that. I understand it's how you've survived 20 years in a world where information is a weapon, and controlling information is survival. I understand it's not malice. I understand all of that. She dropped her hand. I also need you to understand that every time you calculate before you tell me something, you are making a decision that belongs to me. I know. Then stop knowing it and start doing something different. A long silence. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into that register she'd heard only a few times, the register that lived below the operational surface. Where are you going now? He asked. My office. I need to... She stopped. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A message alert. She pulled it from her ear and looked at the screen. Unknown number again, the same one. He's not at his office. Check Bashak Marina. Pier 7. He leaves at midnight. She read it twice. Her pulse did something specific, a hard single thud. The physical response to information arriving faster than the mind's ability to contextualize it. He. Yilmaz. It had to be Yilmaz. The same source who'd been feeding her information since the wedding, since the rooftop, since the first 6 words that had started pulling at everything. Midnight. Pier 7. Bashak. Marina was in the upper Bosphorus, the kind of location where a person who needed to leave Istanbul quickly and quietly would go if they had the right connections. Connections to boats that didn't file departure manifests, to captains who didn't ask questions, to routes that crossed the strait and kept going. If Yilmaz reached that pier tonight, he would be beyond the reach of any story, any document, any legal consequence that Tarek Demir's article could generate. Her building would remain. Her name would remain. The documents Emir was sending tonight would name Yilmaz, would make him the institutional anchor of the corruption story, the man who had overridden the flag, who had approved the tender knowing what he knew, and he would not be here to answer for it. She brought the phone back to her ear. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "I'm listening." She read him the message. The silence this time was different from all the previous silences. It was working silence. She could almost hear the calculations running, the assessment of assets and distances, and what a midnight departure from Bashak Marina would require in terms of counter-movement. "Don't," she said. "Lyra, don't send people. Don't make calls. Don't do whatever you're calculating right now." Her voice was harder than it had been all day, harder than the conversation with Demir, harder than the conference table, harder than the terrace. If Yilmaz disappears in a way that has your fingerprints on it, the story isn't about institutional corruption anymore. The story is about a mafia boss suppressing a municipal official, and my building is in the middle of it, and everything I just did with Demir turns to ash. "He'll run," Damien said. "If he gets to that pier, then he gets to that pier and the documents run tomorrow with his name on them, and Interpol does whatever Interpol does, and that is how this works, when it works legally." She was standing now, without having decided to stand, gripping the edge of the table with her free hand. "I need this to be legal, Damien. I need the path through this to be clean because my name is on a building that needs to still be standing for the next 100 years, and I cannot have it built on anything that isn't clean. You're asking me to do nothing. I'm asking you to do nothing that makes things worse. Those aren't the same thing." Tonight they are. His breathing was audible, controlled but audible, and she knew what that meant. She'd known this man in moments of actual duress, the rare moments when the composed surface thinned enough to let physics through. "All right," he said. "All right. All right isn't—" "I'll do nothing," he said. "Nothing that puts my hands on it. I won't make calls. I won't send anyone. Yilmaz moves under his own power or he doesn't move." A pause. "But I need you to understand what it costs me to sit here and let a man who—" "I know what it costs you," she said. "I know, and I'm asking anyway." Silence. "Where are you going now?" he asked again. "My office," she said. "I have a statement to write and documents to send, and approximately 6 hours before a story runs with my name in it, and I intend to spend those 6 hours doing everything I can do through channels that don't require a boat and a midnight pier." "And after?" She looked out the cafe window at the Cihangir street below, the stepped slope of it, the old buildings in their particular state of elegant deterioration, the lights coming on in windows as evening settled over the hill. Somewhere below this hill, and to the east, her building stood against the skyline. She knew exactly which window she was standing in relative to it. She'd mapped it the day the building opened, had stood at this exact cafe's window, and identified the Meridian Center's profile between two older structures, and had felt something she rarely let herself feel: satisfaction. Simple, structural, hers. She wanted that back. She intended to have it back. "After," she said, "depends on what tomorrow looks like." She ended the call. She was at her office by 7:15. She wrote the statement with Amir on a shared screen, the two of them working through it line by line, and it took 90 minutes to get it to a place where every sentence could bear the weight of scrutiny and none of them said more than was necessary. She was not used to writing sentences that way. Her professional language ran to precision rather than economy. But Amir had a quality of pairing that she found herself trusting, the ability to locate exactly the word that carried the meaning without the weight that surrounded it. At 9, she sent Demir the override document. He acknowledged receipt 40 seconds later. At 9:40, her phone rang. Not Damien, not Seren. A number she didn't recognize, but with an Ankara prefix, and she almost let it go to voicemail, and then something she couldn't name, instinct, exhaustion, the state of being beyond calculation, made her answer. "Ms. Voss." Male voice, older. The particular precision of someone accustomed to saying things that needed to be understood exactly as stated, no more, no less. "My name is not important tonight. What is important is that you understand something before this story runs." "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who has been watching the Kuzi Yapi situation for considerably longer than you have." A pause. The accountant who flagged the irregularity, Ayla Shimshek, she didn't leave municipal employment voluntarily. Lyra's hand tightened on the phone. She was removed because she had begun making copies of documents she shouldn't have had access to, the voice continued. She's been holding those copies for 14 months, waiting for the right moment. Another pause. She contacted Tarek Demir 3 days ago. She is his primary source. The office was very quiet. Amir was looking at her from across the table, reading her face the way lawyers read faces. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because the documents Ayla Shimshek has go considerably further than what's already in play," the voice said. "Further than Yilmaz. Further than Kuzey Yapi." The pause this time had a different quality. Heavier, more deliberate. "There is a second building, Ms. Voss, funded through the same structure. The tender was approved 14 months ago. Construction begins next month." Her stomach dropped. "The architect on record," the voice said, "is your firm." The silence in her office lasted 4 full seconds. "That's not possible," she said. "I would know." "Check your firm's active project register," the voice said. "The Yıldız Cultural Annex. Registered under your firm's license number. Signed off by your senior associate." A pause. "Karen Polat." The name landed like structural failure. The specific, violent physics of load-bearing elements giving way. The whole weight of what had been supported finding nothing beneath it and beginning to fall. Seren. Seren, who had called her Sunday morning about the journalist. Seren, who managed administrative communications. Seren, who had access to the firm's registration system, whose name was on 17 documents per month as a matter of ordinary workflow, who had been with the firm for 2.5 years and who— "Ms. Voss," the voice said, "the story that runs tomorrow morning is not about one building, and Recep Yılmaz is not the most important person running tonight." The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Amir said her name. She didn't respond. She was already opening her laptop, pulling up the firm's active project register. Navigating through the directory she checked every Monday morning as a matter of professional habit, finding the Yıldız Cultural Annex entry, clicking it open, reading the license number at the top of the registration form, her firm's number, correct? And the signature at the bottom. Seren Polat, acting principal. Dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, while Lyra had been preparing for a wedding and managing the compression of feelings she had not let herself feel in 7 years, someone had used her firm's license to register a new project in her name. And the phone in her jacket pocket, the small one she kept for direct messages from contractors, the number she'd never given to journalists or municipal officials, buzzed once. She already knew who it was before she looked. Unknown number. "Get out of your office, now. Don't use the front door." She looked at Amir. He looked back at her with the face of a man who had just watched a client's situation change categories entirely. "How fast," she said, "can you get your car to the building's service entrance?" He was already reaching for his keys. The service entrance of her office building opened onto a narrow alley that smelled of cooking oil from the restaurant next door, and the particular damp of stone that hadn't seen direct sunlight in decades. Amir's car was already there when she pushed through the metal door, engine running, his driver behind the wheel with the patient alertness of someone paid to be ready without knowing for what. She got in. Amir got in beside her. "Where?" the driver said. She thought for 3 seconds. Not about where she needed to go. She already knew that. She was thinking about order of operations, about which thread to pull first without unraveling the ones she needed to hold. "Beşiktaş," she said, "the Meridian Center." Amir turned to look at her. "Why the building?" "Because it's still mine until someone proves otherwise," she said. "And because I need to think somewhere that doesn't have a front door someone just told me not to use." He didn't argue. The driver pulled out of the alley. She spent the 20-minute drive on her phone. First, Damien. She called him back because she needed him to know, and because she had spent enough of the day making unilateral decisions in the name of her own autonomy that making another one now without giving him the information he needed felt not principled but simply punitive. He answered in one ring. "Seren," she said, "my senior associate. She's been registering projects under my firm's license. The Yıldız Cultural Annex, same funding structure as Meridian. Construction starts next month." A silence that was different from all his previous silences. Sharper. more alert. Who told you? Anonymous. Anchor a prefix. I don't know who it is, and right now I don't have time to find out. She watched the city move past the car windows, the Besiktas waterfront coming into view ahead. Someone also told me to leave my office. Different message. Same unknown number. You're out? In Amir's car, going to Meridian. I'll meet you there. Damien, I'm not sending people, he said. I'm coming myself. That's different. A pause that was not a question. Let me come. She looked out at the water, at the lights on the Asian shore, at the space in the skyline where she knew, from memory and from the specific pride that had not yet finished dying, her building stood. Come, she said. Man, the Meridian Cultural Center at night was a different building than the Meridian Cultural Center in daylight. Most buildings were. That was one of the things Lyra had always understood about architecture that clients often didn't. That a building had multiple identities and you were responsible for all of them. The morning identity and the evening identity and the 3 a.m. identity when the cleaning crews were the only ones inside. She had designed the Meridian's exterior lighting herself, had argued 3 separate times for a warmer temperature on the south facade, and been overruled twice before the final approval, and had been right enough that the person who'd overruled her had subsequently cited the result as evidence of his own good judgment, which was the kind of thing that happened in this industry, and which she had learned to absorb without it changing her fundamental relationship to the work. She stood in front of it now. At the plaza level, the main entrance closed for the night, the exterior lighting doing exactly what she'd intended, and looked at the building the way she'd looked at it on the day it opened, which was the way she looked at all finished work, for what it actually was, not what she'd planned for it to be, because those two things were never entirely the same, and the distance between them was where you found out what kind of architect you really were. It was still good. That was the thing that made her chest hurt in the way it hurt when something was both true and unbearable. Whatever was in the foundation, whatever signatures existed on whatever documents, whatever Recep Yilmaz had known when he shook her hand, the building was still what she'd made it. The east facade still caught the light the way she'd calculated. The atrium still did the thing with sound. The proportions were still honest. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Damien came across the plaza with his jacket open and no tie, and the look of a man who had left wherever he'd been quickly, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at the building first before he looked at her. It's good, he said. I know. That doesn't change. I know that too, she said. Knowing it and feeling it are 2 different things right now. He stood beside her and they looked at the building together for a moment, and the city was doing its night thing around them. Traffic, water, the distant percussion of the city's own unsleeping life. And it was the most ordinary moment of a day that had been nothing but extraordinary, and the ordinariness of it was its own kind of relief. Tell me what you need, he said. I need to find Seren, she said. Tonight, before the story runs. I know where she is, he said. She turned to look at him. After you told me about the Yıldız registration, he said carefully, I asked Bora to run a location check on her phone before you tell me that's... Where is she? Lyra said. Karaköy, a cafe near the ferry terminal. He held out his phone with the map on the screen. She's been there for 2 hours. Lyra looked at the map, at the small blue dot on the Asian shore, at the ferry terminal 200 meters from it, and the Başak Marina another 3 kilometers up the coast, and Recep Yılmaz's midnight pier somewhere in that same stretch of waterfront. They're on the same side of the water, she said. Yes. Is that a coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences involving midnight boat departures, he said. She looked at the building one more time. Then she turned away from it. Get us a car, she said. The ferry across the Bosphorus took 22 minutes at that hour, and Lyra spent it at the bow railing with the wind in her hair and the water black below her, and her mind doing the thing it did with structural problems. Not forcing toward resolution, but holding all the load paths simultaneously, letting them settle into their natural arrangement. Seren Polat had been with the firm for 2.5 years. She had come with strong references and a portfolio that showed genuine technical ability. She had been, Lyra had thought, one of those young architects who had the particular combination of talent and appetite that produced serious careers. She had sat across from Lyra at project reviews and asked the right questions and taken notes in the margins of drawings, and once, after a particularly difficult city council session, had come to Lyra's office door and said, "I want to work the way you work. I want to be that certain about things." Lyra had found that moving at the time. She thought about it differently now, from the bow of a Bosphorus ferry in the dark, with the Asian shore coming toward her, and a man standing a few feet away who had also spent years showing her a version of himself she had accepted as complete. The cafe was 3 blocks from the ferry terminal, up a hill, tucked between a tea house and a mobile phone shop. They found it by the map and by the light spilling out of its windows onto the wet pavement, a thin orange light that made the street look like something from a different era. Seren was at a table near the back window, alone. She had a glass of tea in front of her that she wasn't drinking and her phone face down on the table in the particular stillness of someone waiting for something they're not sure they want to arrive. She saw Lyra come through the door and something happened in her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the collapse of something she'd been holding in place by effort. Lyra sat down across from her. Damien stayed at the door. Seren looked at him, then back at Lyra. "I didn't know he'd be with you." "He's not involved in this conversation," Lyra said. "Look at me." Seren looked at her. She was 28 years old and she looked, in this light, like someone who had made a decision months ago that had seemed manageable at the time and had since grown into something that occupied every room of her interior life. "The Yildiz Annex," Lyra said. Seren's hands moved on the table, just slightly. A small reorganization of her fingers around the tea glass. "How did you find out?" "That's not the conversation we're having." "Lyra Hanım, don't." Lyra kept her voice even. She was aware of how close she was to the line where evenness became impossible, and she stayed on the correct side of it because this conversation required precision. "Just tell me, from the beginning, how long, who approached you, and what you were told." Seren was quiet for a moment. Outside, a tram went past, the rumble of it moving through the table's surface. 14 months ago, she said, a man named Serhan. He said he worked for a development partnership. He said the firm needed to expand its project portfolio, that Lyra Hanım was too selective, that there were opportunities being missed. She stopped. Started again. He said it would be simple, the registration, the license number, but just paperwork. The project would run separately. My name is acting principal, but the firm's license. He said it was done this way all the time. "Who is Serhan?" I didn't look into it. I should have." Her voice was doing something unsteady. She pressed it flat. "He paid me 40,000 euros for a signature." Lyra absorbed that, the weight of it, the specific cheapness of it. 40,000 euros for a junior architect who wanted things faster than her career could provide them, which was a want Lyra understood because she had felt it herself and had found different ways to manage it, ways that had cost her in different currencies. "Did you know the money was dirty?" Lyra said. "Not at first." A long pause. "After 6 months, I started. There were things that didn't line up. The Kuzi-Yapi connection. I knew the name from the Meridian documentation." She looked at Lyra with the expression of someone who has run out of ways to soften what they have to say. "I knew. By the time I knew for certain, I had already signed." "And you said nothing." "I was going to. 14 months, Seren. I was going to find a way to." "There is no way," Lyra said. "There is no way that involves silence. There is no version of that story that ends anywhere good." Seren's eyes were bright. She held them steady. "I know that now." "You knew it then." No answer. Lyra sat back in her chair. Outside the window, the Bosphorus was visible between the buildings. That strip of black water that was always visible from somewhere on this shore. The permanent fact of it. She thought about structural honesty and what it actually required. Not the clean architectural principle of it, the version she'd given interviews about, but the lived version. The version that meant saying the thing when it was expensive to say it. Building the thing that would stand when no one was watching. "Yilmaz," she said, "are you meeting him tonight?" Seren looked up sharply. "The marina," Lyra said. "The midnight pier." "He told me to be there," Seren said. Her voice had changed register, dropped into something more frightened. "He said if the story ran, I needed to be gone before morning. He said he could get me out on a boat. He said—" "He's using you," Lyra said. "You understand that. He needs someone to take a portion of the weight when the documents come out." An architect with her signature on a fraudulent registration is a better story than a municipal official who approved dirty money. You're more useful to him as a liability than as a person. The bright eyes spilled over. Seren didn't reach up to deal with it, just sat there with the tears running, and the dignity of not flinching from it was the first thing she'd done tonight that made Lara feel something that was not anger. "What do I do?" Seren said. "You're going to call Emir Kaya," Lyra said, "my lawyer. You're going to call him right now, tonight, and you're going to tell him what you told me. Everything, from the beginning." She put Emir's number on the table between them. "And tomorrow morning, before that story runs, you're going to give a voluntary statement to the relevant authorities. They'll charge me. Probably. I'll lose my license." "Yes," Lyra said, "you will." She looked at her. This young woman, with her talent and her appetite and the 40,000 euros that had eaten through the foundations of everything she was building. "But you'll have done the one thing that makes any of it survivable. You'll have told the truth when it cost you the most to tell it." Seren looked at the number on the table for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Lyra stood. She picked up her jacket and looked at Seren one last time and said, "Don't go to the marina. Whatever Yilmaz told you, whatever he promised, don't go." She walked to the door where Damien was waiting. Outside, the street was cool and damp, and the tram had gone, and the city was quieter at this particular hour on this particular street. She stood on the pavement and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Damien stood beside her, not touching, not speaking. Present. After a moment she said, "Yilmaz is still getting to that pier." "I know. And you're not going to do anything about it." A pause. She could hear him breathing. "I made a call this afternoon," he said. "Not to anyone on my payroll. To someone in the financial crimes unit, anonymously. I told them about the pier and the time and the name." He paused again. "That's all I did. What they choose to do with that information is not my management." She turned to look at him. He looked back, and in the cafe light coming through the window, he looked like what he was. A man who had spent 20 years operating in the space between legal and not, who had built something powerful on principles that did not always align with institutional ones, who had spent 14 months trying to correct a wrong through his own channels and had run out of road. A man who had tonight, for the first time she could document, chosen the slower and less certain mechanism of the law over the faster and more absolute mechanisms he had available. "That was harder for you than anything else tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she watched his face with the full attention she'd been withholding and managing and carefully rationing for 24 hours. There was tiredness in it, and the residue of the day's accumulated costs, and something underneath those things that had been there last night on the rooftop and had not gone away, something that was not hope exactly, because hope was too fragile a word for the quality of it. Something more like the particular persistence of a thing that has survived long enough to become structural. "Come on," she said. "I need to get back across the water." The story ran at 6:47 the next morning. Lyra was awake when it published, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and her laptop, the Istanbul skyline visible through the windows in the pale early light. She read it 3 times. Tarek Demir had used the override document. He had named Yilmaz as the central institutional figure, the municipal official who had buried the accountant's flag, who had approved the tender with knowledge of the funding irregularity, who had, as of 6 that morning, been detained at Başak Marina attempting to depart Istanbul on a private vessel. That detail was in the story's final paragraph, one sentence, almost casual, the way the most significant facts sometimes arrived. Her name was in the story. Her building's name was in the story. The framing was accurate. Architect who had reviewed documents prepared to conceal the irregularity, who had had no knowledge of the funding source, who had, upon discovery, cooperated fully with authorities and provided documentation. It was not a comfortable paragraph to have written about one's building. It was accurate, and accuracy was what she had asked for. Damien's name was in the story. One paragraph, appropriately contextualized, a source who had independently identified the funding irregularity and had been working through financial restructuring to correct it prior to the story's publication, with a source close to the investigation noting his cooperation with the Financial Crimes Unit. It was careful. It was honest. It was the kind of paragraph that would generate its own set of consequences for him, in his world, among the people who monitored what his name appeared next to and why. He had known it would. He had done it anyway. She closed the laptop. She sat with the coffee and the morning light and the skyline, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the managed version, not the processed version, not the version she had already begun to convert into professional positioning and narrative strategy. The actual weight. Her building, her name, the 3 years of work, and the things she had believed about what she had built, now permanently complicated by the knowledge of what had been underneath it. She didn't think it had broken her. She thought it had done something more interesting and more difficult than breaking. It had given her information about where her actual foundations were. Her phone rang at 7:15, Celine calling from somewhere that sounded warm and distant. "I read it," Celine said. "I know you did." "Are you all right?" "Not entirely," Lyra said. "Enough." A pause. "And Damien?" "That's a longer conversation. I have time. We're at a resort in Rhodes, and Karem is asleep, and I've been sitting on this balcony reading that story for an hour." Celine's voice had the quality it had when she was being careful with someone she loved. "Talk to me." Lyra looked at the skyline, at the Meridian Center's profile in the morning light, identifiable by its silhouette, by the particular angle of its east facade catching the early sun. Her building. Still hers. "He spent 7 years following my work," she said. "Not because he was obsessed, not because he couldn't let go, because it was the only way he knew to stay near me without asking for something I hadn't offered." She paused. "And then when he found something wrong in my building, he tried to fix it without telling me. Because that's how he loves things. By taking the problem into himself. By carrying it." "That's not always the wrong way to love someone," Celine said carefully. "It's not the right way either." "No," Celine said. "It's a human way, which is harder to know what to do with." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "He made a call last night to the financial crimes unit. He gave them information that led to Yilmaz being detained through legitimate channels, not his channels." She stopped. "You don't know what that costs a man like him. The admission that his way isn't always the only way. Do you know what it costs him?" "I think so," she said. "I think that's maybe the first time I've really understood what it would take for him to change something that's been structural since before he knew me." "And what are you going to do with that?" Celine said. The question sat in the morning air. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the sounds of it coming up through the open window, the particular compressed noise of 10 million people beginning another day. The Bosphorus was visible between the buildings, the same water it had always been, running between its two shores without preference, cold and indifferent and connective. "I'm going to have dinner with him," Lyra said. Celine was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Tuesday?" "He suggested Tuesday," Lyra said. "I think I'll let him keep that." They met on Tuesday evening at a restaurant in Arnavutkoi that occupied the ground floor of a wooden Bosphorus house so old it seemed to be held together partly by habit. Lyra arrived first, at the table by the window, and watched the water while she waited. He was on time. He sat across from her and looked at her with the full force of his attention, that specific quality of being seen by him that she had spent 7 years learning to live without and had not successfully replaced with anything else, and she looked back without managing it. "How are you?" he said. "Tired," she said. "Intact." She picked up the menu, looked at it, set it down. "The restructuring. Damir says the clean allocation can be fully substituted within 60 days. The building's legal position should be clear by end of summer." Bora confirmed the same, he said. "The Financial Crimes Unit has been in contact. They want a formal accounting of the restructuring timeline." He paused. "I'm cooperating." "I know." "Fully. Not through channels, directly." She looked at him. The word fully in his vocabulary in this context was not a small word. It was a word that carried operational cost, that touched the edges of structures he had built carefully over 20 years. She understood what it meant for him to use it this way. "That's going to cause you problems," she said. "Some," he said. "Manageable ones." "You don't have to—" "I do," he said. "Because your name is on that building. And because the only way through this that doesn't leave something broken permanently is the clean way. He held her gaze. I know that now. I should have known it 14 months ago. You're getting better at saying the things you should have said earlier, she said. I have a strong incentive. The waiter came. They ordered without ceremony. She had eaten at this restaurant twice before and knew what was good, and he had the easy relationship with menus of someone who eats at enough tables that the choice itself isn't weighted. After the waiter left, there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. That was the thing about this specific silence that she was willing to admit, if only to herself. It was not a silence that needed to be filled. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. When you left 7 years ago, when you made that call, I told myself for a long time that I understood why, that I could map the logic of it. I was arrogant, I had assumed. I had built a future around a woman I loved without asking her what she wanted. He looked at the water outside the window. But I didn't understand it. Not really. Not until yesterday, when you sat across from Seren in that cafe. She waited. You gave her the most honest thing you could give her, he said. Not protection, not a way out. The truth about what she'd done and what it cost and what was on the other side of it, if she chose it. You didn't manage it for her. He turned back to look at her. I've been managing things for people my whole adult life. I thought that was care. I thought it was what you did for the people you... He stopped, started again. Watching you last night, I understood the difference between managing someone and trusting them. She looked at him across the table. This man who was not the man she had left, who was that man extended forward by 7 years of consequence and understanding, carrying the same bones but differently weighted. She thought about what it meant to love a person across the distance of who they had been and who they were becoming, and whether the distance itself was a problem or whether it was simply the nature of time. I'm not the same person I was either, she said. I know. I ran from something real. I used a real grievance to do it, but I ran. I know that too. I'm not going to run again, she said. Not a promise in the romantic sense of promises. Something more structural than that. A statement about load capacity, about what she had learned about her own foundations in the last 48 hours. But I'm also not going to disappear into someone else's plans. If this... She gestured between them, the small, precise gesture of a woman who is careful with words and has run out of carefulness for everything except the most important ones. If this becomes something, it becomes something we build together, with all the drawings on the table. No managed versions. All the drawings on the table, he said. Every structural compromise, every deviation from the original plan, every place where we had to adapt because the conditions were different from what we expected. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him receive that. Actually receive it, not process it toward a response, but absorb the weight of it, the way a foundation absorbs load, taking it in and distributing it and letting it change the calculation. That's a harder build than either of us has done, he said. Yes, she said. It is. I'm not afraid of hard builds. I know you're not. She picked up her wine glass. I'm the one who is afraid. I want you to know I'm aware of that, not as a confession, as information, because you should have accurate information about the person you're sitting across from. He picked up his own glass. Not a toast, just the parallel gesture, the alignment of two people at a table deciding to occupy the same moment without a frame around it. Accurate information, he said. That's all I want. Then here it is, she said. I moved to Istanbul 4 years ago partly because of you. Not to find you, I wasn't ready to find you, but because this was the city where the version of myself I wanted to become made the most sense, and you were part of how I understood that city, even when you weren't in it. She looked out at the water. That's embarrassing to say. It's honest, he said. Those are sometimes the same thing. Outside, the Bosphorus moved the way it always moved, the way it had moved before either of them existed and would move after, indifferent and constant and connecting the parts of the city that couldn't reach each other any other way. The lights of the Asian shore were coming on in the early evening, one by one, the way lights came on in buildings. Not all at once, but gradually, each one its own decision, the whole illuminated together by accumulation. She had designed one of the buildings in that skyline. It was still there. Tink. 2 months later, Recep Yilmaz was formally charged with abuse of public office and participation in a criminal financial operation. The trial date was set for the following spring. Serenpalat surrendered her architectural license voluntarily and gave a full statement to the Financial Crimes Unit that named Serhan Doğan, a mid-level operator in Orhan Shahin's network, as the man who had approached her. Doğan was arrested 3 weeks later in Izmir. Shahin's operation, exposed from multiple sides simultaneously, began the slow institutional collapse that happens when the documents that were always there finally reach the right people. The Yıldız Cultural Annex project was cancelled. The registration was voided. Lira's firm issued a public statement that had been written by Amir Kaya and reviewed 17 times, and which said everything it needed to say in the most accurate language available. The Meridian Cultural Center remained open throughout. On a Thursday morning in early September, Lira stood in the atrium and listened to what the space did with ambient sound. The particular frequency of footsteps on the limestone floor, the way voices moved up through the height of the room and dispersed near the skylight, the deep quiet between sounds that was not emptiness but density, all the cubic meters of space doing exactly what she had calculated they would do, holding the sound and then releasing it. A school group came through on a tour, 20 children in yellow vests, a teacher at the front, and a museum guide walking backward and talking about architectural intention. One of the children, a girl, maybe 9, with her hair in 2 uneven plaits, stopped in the center of the atrium and looked up at the skylight and turned in a slow circle with her arms out, as if she was trying to feel the geometry of the space with her whole body. Lyra watched her. That was why you built things. Not for the articles in the review journals, not for the approval sessions, or the professional shortlists, or the keynotes in Copenhagen. For a 9-year-old girl turning in circles in an atrium, feeling with her body what it meant to be inside something built with care. She took out her phone and called Damien. He answered on the second ring. "Are you busy?" she said. "Not for you," he said. The line that would have been a line from anyone else, that was from him simply a fact. "I'm at the building," she said. "Come see it. I want to show you something." A pause. Not hesitation, just the beat of a man orienting toward a direction. "An hour," he said. "An hour," she said. She hung up and put the phone away and looked up at the skylight herself, at the particular quality of the September light coming through it, the angle of it on the limestone floor, the warmth of it landing on the back of her neck. The building stood. It had cost her more than she'd known when she built it. That was true of the best things, she thought, that the full cost was only visible in retrospect, once you could see the whole structure and understand which elements had been load-bearing all along. She understood now. Most of it. Enough. The girl in the yellow vest had stopped turning and was looking at Lyra with the direct, unself-conscious appraisal of a child. "Did you make this?" she said. Lyra looked at her. "Yes," she said. "It sounds like the inside of a shell," the girl said. Then her teacher called her name and she ran, her yellow vest bright in the atrium light, back toward the group and away. Lyra stood in the middle of her building and waited for Damien to arrive. The strongest empires, she thought, were not built on power. They were built on truth. And truth, real truth, the structural kind, the kind that held weight, was not something you arrived at once and kept. It was something you chose, again and again, in the small daily decisions that no one else witnessed. She had been choosing it for 2 months. She intended to keep choosing it. Outside, the city moved and the water ran between its shores, and the light fell through the skylight and landed on limestone, and the building held, as it was designed to hold, as all honest things hold when they have been built correctly from the ground up. She was ready.